Hello, my name is Lisa Shea, and this video is part of my series on horror authors, horror stories, horror short stories, horror novels, and all things horror. So today we're going to talk about my 20th horror short story, The Morning I Didn't Wake Up. And this is 9 pages long, 2718 words long. So I'm going to talk about the meaning of the story in depth, so if you haven't read it yet and you care about spoilers, then this is a good time to go read it. It's pretty short. You can read it pretty quickly. And if you don't care about spoilers, then we will go ahead and we will talk about how the story was crafted. So this story is written in first person. That means that the person saying, I did this and I did that. And you're seeing completely in her thoughts, but you're never looking at her from a third person point of view. So you don't have a sense of what she looks like or anything like that. And you don't even have a sense of her name, because people don't tend to think of themselves by their name. They tend to think of themselves just as I. So she has a lot of insomnia problems. She has problems where she doesn't really sleep, but she's sort of in a half sleep, half awake state. And she's been having these dreams where she's asleep, but she's dreaming that she's in the house, which happens to me all the time. So she's in the house, but things aren't quite right. The walls aren't the right color. The kitchen's not quite right. Her pet dog is being all strange. So in her dream, she goes into her bedroom and lays down, because often when she's having these kinds of dreams, the act of laying down in the dream ends up waking her back up into real life. So she gives that a shot, but she doesn't wake up. She's just still laying there in her dream on her bed, wishing that she could wake up. So she decides that she might as well just get up and keep doing stuff around the house. So her alarm clock's broken. She doesn't know what time it is, but it's sort of grayish out, so she figures it must be morning. Her dog's being very odd acting, but everything in this dream is odd acting, so she's really not sure what's going on. She opens the back door and lets him out so he can go do his doggy things, and he goes to the far end of the lawn. The sky is really strange. There's rust colors in the sky. California's having all these wildfires, and she figures that the smoke is coming over from California, but that everything is just screwed up in this dream state anyway. The walls look like they're moving. They're going in and out, and the shadows are undulating. So there's all sorts of things that are just not quite right about this world that she's in. She goes into the kitchen. She remembers about her mother who died in a car crash. And all of a sudden the coffee pot turns on. She says, oh, all right, well, I got some sense of normalcy here. It's 9 o'clock in the morning, so I get to at least know what time of day it is. And she checks on her kitchen table, and she sees that her father's check to pay for her bills has come in. So now we get a sense that the father is off in Wisconsin and is an absent father. So her mother's dead, her father's absent, and it's just her alone in this house having these issues with dreaming and staying awake. And the father used to be violent. Her mother used to drink heavily. And now we learned that the mother was drinking in the night of the car crash, and that it's fortunate that she didn't hurt anyone, as drunk people sometimes do. You know, that if she was going to crash, at least she only hurt herself out of her drinking habit. So she gets the coffee mug. She puts the coffee in. Now the coffee doesn't even taste right, so nothing is quite right in this sort of dream state that she's in. She can see that her dog is burrowing under the back fence, and she doesn't really care at this point. She talks about the fences blocking her neighbors from seeing the parents fighting all the time. The walls are undulating again, which means rippling, if you don't know what undulating means. And now the air seems thick, so when she moves her hand through the air, it feels like there's resistance against it, like it's something tangible there, sort of like maple syrup or molasses or something thick. But it's clear, but she can feel the effort of it. So she gives thoughts about what she could do with this thick air, but she decides that she shouldn't give it a shot, because all of a sudden she could end up hurting herself. And we talk some more about how the parents fought and hurt each other and so on. And we talk some about how when she was young, she used to cause harm to animals, in this case burning ants, and it's the whole cascade. She's getting violence around her, and then she puts violence onto things that are unable to resist her, so it creates a cycle. So she's finishing off her not quite right coffee. She's thinking about this air and how thick it is, and she tries to toss her mug, and because the air is so thick, she sees it drifting and drifting towards the hard floor, and eventually it going in slow motion, and it touches the edge of the hard floor, and all the little pieces of mug, as it shatters, start to spread out. and she thinks of it like a flower. So I'm sure we've all seen those time-lapse movies that show things exploding in slow motion or growing in slow motion. So that's what it all draws to her mind. And everything seems thick and in slow motion and as if it isn't really real. So she realizes that her dog is gone and it doesn't even matter to her. She's just so disassociated with the world that her father's gone and her dog is gone and she's all alone. So she decides that she's going to go upstairs and explore this thick air, but she didn't want to just jump off the table. She wanted to try something a little more proof that she's really in this alternate reality. She goes up into the attic. She gets up to the vent. I happen to have a vent in my attic where the bats hang out. She thinks about the bats, how they all go off in caves and they die. So even that doesn't get any empathy out of her. It's something that concerns me greatly, that we have all of our bats dying because they're such a critical part of our food chain. But to her, it's just another sign that something is awful in this world and that there's nothing she can do about it, and she's just going to have to go on with her life. So the air is thick up here. Now we find out that the mother not only died drunk driving, but that the main character was in the house when the mother left, and the main character knew that the mother was trying to go out and get more alcohol in a drunk state in her car, and tried to stop her mother but wasn't quite effective at it. So now we know the main character feels some guilt about not having done enough to be able to prevent her mother from, in essence, killing herself. So the main character gets to the vent. Things are still the air is still seeming thick. The slats are falling in slow motion down to the floor. She sits there. She can see over the fence now, and she sees that her neighbor sees her and realizes what's going on and is calling the police. But of course the police aren't going to get there in time. So, and again, the main character just sort of observes this in a dispassionate sort of way. Oh, my neighbor's doing this. Oh, it doesn't really matter. There's no use caring about anything at all. And she thinks of herself as a dandelion seed that she can just swirl around for years, and maybe the mother will come back to life, maybe the father will come back, and maybe there'd be some way to handle all of the misery and self-loathing and everything that causes people to combust and self-destruct. And she pushes herself off the ledge, and undoubtedly, since this is the real world, she just falls straight to the pavement and dies. So the end is not that she's consciously committing suicide, but she is just in such a state at this point, such a fog and a state of depression over her father leaving and her mother dying, and all of the yelling and screaming. Her entire life has been pain, and she's then reaped that pain onto things that she could get her hands on, which in this case were ants, but it's just an indication of, she probably was bullying people in school and doing other things because she was so upset. And now she's just drawn in on herself, where she can barely do anything, barely see the world as a real world anymore. Everything just feels unnatural and fake, and fantasy worlds, something that's not right about anything at all. And there's probably a part of her that knew if she jumped off of the attic level that she would die. But there's other parts of her that just really didn't care. She just said, all right, well, the air's thick, let's see what happens. So she lost all sense of caring, lost her empathy, lost her compassion, and so on. So I've had a person tell me that they thought horror stories should have only blood and gore and super nasty things in them. And there's more than enough stories like that out there already. Someone wants to read about gore. I have about 20 different authors that I personally talk with that you can go read their stories, and they are full of gore and overt violence and all that kind of stuff. That's not what I write, and there's no reason for every person to write gore stories or every person to write super nasty kinds of stories. I mean, there's plenty of people writing that already. So there's a giant audience and a giant market library of stories that in that category. My stories are a different category, and there's room for all different types of horror out there in the world. So my stories are more psychological. They aren't about gore. They aren't about people being whipped to death or things like that. In general, I mean, I do have people die in some of my stories, but again, I don't talk about entrails pouring out of your body or blood gushing out of your body or that sorts of things. I'm going for a different kind of horror, and the horror is the way that our current everyday life is eating away at people of all different levels, male and female, although I tend to mostly write about women characters, all different ages, and how we need to be aware of this and how every life matters. Every elderly person that's in a nursing home should be paid attention. Every person with mental challenges should be paid attention to. And I support battered women's shelters with all of my work. So absolutely, I feel that people who are actually being brutally beaten every day should be rescued right away. That's part of the whole reason I'm doing this kind of work and putting my stories out there. But I also feel that we should not dismiss other people and say, oh, you aren't being beaten enough, so therefore you should just suck it up and live with it. You know, every person deserves to be helped and to be brought to a place where they can have a better life. So I do feel about that strongly. If a mentally ill person is not being beaten every day with whips, but is being emotionally abused every day, that is also bad. And that's something that we need to address and make better for that person. So I do feel strongly about that. And hopefully I can help more people feel strongly about that. So in this particular case, there's no sense that she was brutally beaten, and there's no reason for her to be thinking about having her body flayed or whatever other kinds of things. It's a more psychological trauma she went through her entire life, and the guilt that she has laid on her by the death of her mother, and the feeling that she was partially responsible for the split up of her parents, and all of that stuff has driven her into a dark, deep depression, which ends up making her take her life. And suicide is another very important topic to me, and I think it's something that we need to address far better as a society. So those are a lot of the thoughts that came into why I wrote this, the thoughts of people who are left alone with these feelings of dark depression, who grew up with alcoholism and violence in their families, and who then get abandoned by our community in a sense that her parents had put up these giant walls, and she never had the emotional strength to take them down or to talk to the neighbors or anything. So she was brought up in isolation, and now she is trapped in this isolation. And it's only at the last minute when she climbs up preparing to kill herself that a neighbor is able to make that connection with her, but by then it's too late. So all of those are a great shame about the way our world is right now, and hopefully that's something that we can work on. So let me know if you have any questions about this story and why I wrote it and why I wrote it the way that it is and what kinds of thoughts were going through my head. You can put comments to ask me questions. I'm happy to answer. Or you can post on Facebook, Twitter, my blog. There's all sorts of different ways in social media to reach me. Please like and subscribe, and I will post one of these for every story I write so that people, sometimes my stories are a little vague in their psychological aspect. So this will hopefully answer most of your questions. It's not that she was on drugs. She wasn't tripping on LSD or anything like that. It was just in her depth of despair and depression, her mind wasn't coping well with the world anymore, and it was mixing the dream state and the awake state. So during this whole story, she is awake. She just can no longer distinguish between when she's dreaming and when she's awake. All right, so like and subscribe. Please come back and look for more of my videos, and have a great week.